prophecy outmatched the script that you wrote. How you spit to a Sith with a grip on your throat. I have the power, I shall command, riding to the top with a one-man plan. I have energy you cannot learn. I was born ruthless and I'm rooting on the prospect to shoot me stormtroopers. Your form's losing any...
Hello, this is Critical Reads, exploring books one universe at a time, or in other words, books as I see them. I'm your host, G. Lee, educated moron and unpublished author extraordinaire. Today's book will be dun 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 dun, another Edward Rutherfurd book, Paris. All right, so I've written a more extensive bio on Rutherfurd. So if you would like to learn more, go check out my review of China. Edward Rutherfurd is a pen name for Francis Edward Wintle, and he was born in 1948 in Salisbury, England. He attended the University of Cambridge and Stanford Business School. He worked in political research and publishing until 1983 when he wrote his debut work, Serum, which was published in 1987. And spent 23 weeks on the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list, no less. He's written 9 books in total: Ruska, The Forest, London, Princes of Ireland, Rebels of Ireland, New York, Paris, and China. Okay, the book details now. This was published in hardback in 2013 by Doubleday in America. The same year in the UK by Houghton and Stoddard. It was also published in paperback in numerous editions in 2014 by Ballantine Books and a few others. And Edward Rutherfurd's website is at edwardrutherfurd.com, and the Furd has a U in it. I'm going to preface my discussion on Paris in the same way that I did on my discussion with China. Edward Rutherfurd is the greatest living historical novelist, possibly the greatest of all time. Having said that, let me begin. Paris, city of love, city of dreams, city of splendor, city of saints and scholars, city of gaiety, sink of iniquity. So opens Rutherfurd's novel, which was at once a magnificent whirlwind portrayal of bourgeois privilege, aristocratic snobbery, and the toiling lower classes. The narratives in Rutherfurd's comprehensive study span from the time of the Third Republic to the travails of World War I to the horrors of the Nazi occupation, closing with a glimpse of the city during the 60s. Rutherfurd's novel is among the greatest works in the arena of historical fiction, while remaining a bitter disappointment in contrast to his other achievements. If you're watching, I'm sorry, but it gets better. Whereas the majority of his novels portray the entire history of the region he is covering, like China, Paris fails to. His 2-page prologue that deals with everything from Julius Caesar's founding of the town to the collapse of the Paris Commune, with the briefest of glancing blows, piqued my interest, serving to remind me of all the history I was missing out on. Whereas Serum began with the glacial melt at the end of the last ice age, London portrayed the Celtic tribe subdued by the Romans. The Dublin saga began with the Celtic Druids and the tribes of Ireland. Paris skipped right to the last quarter of the 19th century. What about the Parsi tribes, I thought? What about the Hun invasions of Gaul, the coming of the Vikings, the collapse of the Roman Empire, the arrival of Christianity in the Dark Ages? Of any historical author I know of, there are none that set the atmosphere like Rutherfurd does. None has ever convinced me so fully that I was experiencing history as he saw it. Not a single writer has made me see the vision with the clarity that he is able to establish. If only he had told the story of Napoleon's meteoric rise and his rule over Paris. His conquest of Europe, the burning of Moscow, and the catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Russian Tsar Alexander I and English Duke of Wellington is a story that could have been told from the perspective of the Parisians in a way that no one else could relate. Rutherfurd's medieval atmosphere is always my favorite part of his novels. And what better city in Europe could such a tale be illustrated? There was no War of the Roses, very little of Joan of Arc, and just hints of the French Revolution, periods and events that are among the brightest in the annals of global history. The earliest signs of human activity in the region go back to 8000 BC. The city was established in 52 BC. If he wasn't going to include a count of the former, I feel like he was bound by his own literary tradition to start it during the latter. Instead, Rutherfurd began his account of the City of Light during the time frame where I tend to lose interest in his other novels. Now, I know I'm speaking from my own biases, given that I'm less interested in current history from about the end of the 19th century to up until now. But I cannot describe my disappointment when I opened the table of contents expecting what I've been led to expect by his previous works, only to find that it would not be the case in Paris. The chapters that did cover ancient Paris were periodic flashbacks that only served to support the narratives of the present timeline of this novel. To be fair, this was very creative structurally. I haven't seen much of it done before, and it made for a very absorbing read. Indeed, these were my favorite sections of the novel, a fact which was frustrated by their extreme brevity. Just as I was becoming absorbed and involved in the thread of the narrative, it felt like the rug had been taken out from under me. In the vast bulk of Rutherfurd's sagas, each chapter is expansive, a novella in and of itself, and what follows is a great leap forward, covering the same familial lines generations later. Here, the chapters were shorter and followed the same characters throughout the book. This was a massive shift, one I appreciated, but which also made me feel that I was missing out. It reads more like The Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann or 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez than Sarum or Ruska by Rutherfurd. More like a 19th century English novel set in France than a historical epic. As I've said in my review of China, writing is an art form and artists like to experiment. No writer wants to produce the same novel with a different skin over and over again. But Rutherfurd's approach to his reader should have been different. James A. Michener, Rutherfurd's primary influence, did not always write in the same format. He played with subject material and timelines, but he named it something else. Formatting the title as Rutherfurd did his earlier works leads the reader to expect that the structure of the book will also be the same. In my opinion, this is what the author should have done. Call it something else, anything else. To do otherwise disappoints the reader, and in the literary world, there is nothing less forgiving than a disappointed reader. Do not let that suggest that this work was anything but what it was, a literary triumph. I was just as taken in by the plot, just as invested in the characters as I had been with every other Rutherfurd novel. He's the best, hands down. I felt the shock and awe of the Jews betrayed by King Philip the Fair in the 14th century after he promised he'd protect them from the Inquisition if they funded him, only to arrest every Jewish man, woman, and child before evicting them from the country with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and 12 sous in their pocket. The Machiavellian machinations of the Catholic Queen Catherine de' Medici, inviting the most prominent Protestants in France to her daughter's wedding to Protestant King Henry of Navarre, so that they'd be gathered in one place for a slaughter, was written so well I could see the bloodbath myself. As the general violence turned into a sort of medieval dystopia in which all of France's Protestants who did not flee were killed in the streets by the mob, I felt their terror. When the boy Simon Renard took in the little Protestant girl and his family snuck her to a different province, I swelled with pride. I was there with Thomas Gascon when he defended his younger brother Luke from the local gang of miscreant boys. I scaled the dizzying heights with him as he constructed the Eiffel Tower. It caused me actual sorrow that Henry VIII, covered so often in Rutherfurd's other novels, was not portrayed through the eyes of the Parisians. I marveled at the power exerted by the robber king Lesord the Deaf, who heard not the cries of those who crossed him, as he befriended the poor nobleman Jacques de Sig. Later, when Jacques used that friendship to turn him over to the king's men for torture and beheading, I hated the aristocracy for it. The vow of the child Jean Lesord, in the present narrative, to murder Roland, the son of the de Sig, who ordered Jean's father to be executed by firing squad, had me riveted. During World War I, when Roland, knowing of Jean's earlier attempt on his life, saved him from being shot for mutiny, I raged that Rutherfurd passed on the opportunity for an ironic tragedy that he avoided when Jean did not take his chance to shoot him on the battlefield, but understood later when when Roland's grandson became a member of the resistance to the Nazi occupation. I appreciated the fairness with which he treated the anarchist movement and its ideology, his breadth of knowledge on the founders, Proudhon, Kropotkin, and Bakunin, understood that Jean's hatred of the philosophy was his own and not the author's. The Red Terror was portrayed in a way that no author could have accomplished, and Rutherfurd was able to make me hate its motivating force, Robespierre, and revel in the satisfaction of seeing his machine devour him with his own guillotine. The irony of the widow Lesord making false accusations that led to the beheading of that era's de Sig, so that a Lesord had caused the death of a de Sig, and a de Sig had caused the death of a Lesord, was powerful and made up for Jean sparing Roland's life earlier. The representations of the Third Reich in France during World War II were just as ghastly as their real-world equivalents. The ugly authoritarianism and the consequent death of hope was balanced by the heroics of the resistance, culminating in the novel's greatest irony when Thomas, risking everything to resist the Nazis, shot his own brother Luke when he had found out that Luke had betrayed his group of freedom fighters. The relief I felt when the Allied forces triumphed was as real as if I had been there myself. The more I read, the more absorbed, involved, and captivated I became, the more the sense of disappointment I felt as I began the book was replaced by the disappointment I felt when I had completed the book. This novel spent weeks on my book pile because it was the only Rutherfurd novel I had left to read. And that hesitation at knowing it was the last one transformed into grief once I turned the final page. Now for the inconsistency section of my show. Now, while there were themes and decisions of characters that I didn't necessarily buy, there was nothing I would actually call inconsistent. So we can move on to the quotes section of the show. And I picked 3. There were a bunch more, but there were 3 that seemed better than the rest. The nature of a prejudice is that those who possess it have no idea that it is prejudice at all. Next one. All governments are corrupt. It's just a question of degree. Whether Rutherfurd believes that or it was just his character speaking, who knows? I believe it. And finally, the bourgeois will always choose comfort over reality. Now it's time for the ratings. I'm giving this one 2 ratings. The first is in comparison with his other works. This was an amazing book, but it was my least favorite. And I'd give it a 7 out of a 10 when compared with his other novels. However, if we're ranking it on its own merit, I would give it a 9 out of 10. Okay. In closing, I'd like to say that if you're an author and you want me to review your work in the event that I get a YouTube following and a lot of views, you can contact me on Twitter through my DMs. Of course, you will be required to make sure I have a copy of your work. And also remember, when buying a book, get a hard copy, not digital. Hard copy. Love books, not pixels.